You likely won't be surprised to hear that Johnson's got himself in some hot water recently. You probably also won't be surprised to hear that it was Brexit-related hot water. At the end of last week, Johnson spoke in Northern Ireland, explaining how the relationship between Great Britain and Northern Ireland is set to work under his Brexit deal. The problem is many accused him of not actually understanding how his own deal works. In fact, Keir Starmer, the shadow Brexit secretary, called him out directly on Twitter, saying that Boris Johnson either doesn't understand the deal he's negotiated or he isn't telling the truth. Probably both. So in this video we're going to look at what Johnson said, how accurate it is, and why the Prime Minister might have ended up in this mess. Before we get to that though, a quick shout out to our merch store. That's because we've just put out some Christmas merch. We've recreated our ever popular order shirt in Christmas format, turning it into a Christmas jumper. Now this isn't actually a Christmas jumper, but you can get the knit effect design on shirts, hoodies or jumpers. Find out more by clicking the link in the description down below. Get Brexit done has been the Conservative slogan throughout the campaign so far. It's a simple message, but actually getting Brexit done is a complex progress, one that Johnson tried to explain in Northern Ireland at the end of last week. So let's start by taking a look over what Johnson had to say, his claims about his own Brexit deal.
But so when you come out of the EU customs union, which is what we've done, you have to have some way of checking that goods that might attract a tariff going from the United Kingdom into Ireland pay that tariff. The only place you can do it, if you don't do it at the border, is at the border in Northern Ireland. There will not be tariffs or checks on goods coming from GB to I that are not going on to Ireland. That's the whole point. And the great thing that's been misunderstood about this is there will not be checks. There will not be checks. I speak as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and a passionate unionist. There will not be checks on goods going from Northern Ireland to Great Britain. Because we're the government of the United Kingdom and we will not institute or implement or enact such checks. And the idea that Tato crisps from Tandragee Castle are going to be, by some process, it's just nonsense.
So the key part of this clip is how the border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain is set to operate under Johnson's deal. In the speech to Conservative members, the Prime Minister reassures the assembled crowd that they wouldn't have to fill out any additional paperwork. He even commented that if businesses were asked to fill out any additional paperwork, they should phone him, and according to him, he'll direct them to throw that form in the bin. This is likely encouraging to the audience in the room. Many in Northern Ireland are worried that Johnson's deal would erect a border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. This would obviously make trade more difficult and could damage the Northern Irish economy, but it could also damage the union. So having the Prime Minister in the room, reassuring them of his unionist credentials and saying that business would be no harder under his deal is great news. The problem is, as Starmer identified, that it might not be 100% accurate. In fact, Johnson's account contradicts what Steve Barclay, the Brexit secretary, told the House of Lords EU committee. When speaking to the committee, Barclay initially denied that businesses would need to make any declarations between Northern Ireland and Great Britain.
Under your proposals, will Northern Ireland businesses that trade with Great Britain have to complete export declarations?
If they're going, well, if they're moving goods to Northern Ireland, they're not exporting.
From Northern Ireland to Great Britain.
From Northern Ireland to Great Britain, no, because we've said in terms of from Northern Ireland to GB that it will be frictionless. And so no, there wouldn't be export.
Even though the Union Customs Code, I believe, says that when they leave the customs union, goods do have to complete these declarations.
I would have to come back and write to you on that.
Okay.
My recollection was that there weren't requirements coming from Northern Ireland into GB on that. But.
However, a few minutes later, he made a clarification on the issue.
But I also, just come back to Lord Wood because he asked a very fair question on declarations. Just to be clear, the exit summary declarations will be required in terms of Northern Ireland to GB.
That's a helpful clarification.
So despite some initial confusion, the Brexit Secretary made clear to the House of Lords EU Committee that goods travelling from Northern Ireland to Great Britain would indeed require exit summary declarations. Now you could spend hours debating whether this extra paperwork constitutes a check, but Barclay is making clear that there will be extra procedures in place under Johnson's deal. It's this that many are accusing Johnson of contradicting or not understanding. His statements in Northern Ireland last week made clear that trade would be frictionless, throw away extra paperwork in the bin. But that certainly doesn't seem to match the statements made by Barclay. Remember, the Prime Minister made it clear that there will be no forms, no checks, no barriers of any kind. You will have unfettered access. So this is where we get into difficult territory. It's certainly clear that these two statements don't align. Johnson describes a Brexit deal which leads to no extra checks, and Barclay explains that paperwork will be necessary. Lord Stuart Wood, the person who actually asked Barclay the question, said to the BBC after the session that Barclay's answers meant that a customs border was being created between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. But just because these two claims don't seem to line up, doesn't necessarily mean all that much in politics. Call us cynical, but it's hardly surprising to hear a political party spinning a narrative to fit the audience that they're addressing. And by discussing it, we get into a land of political chicanery, where we start arguing what specific words actually mean. Michael Gove, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, was actually asked about this, with a journalist asking, the Prime Minister said last night that there'll be no checks under the Brexit deal, but there will be customs forms that need to be filled out. How do they not count as checks? Gove responded to the interviewer saying that it will be the case that there will be some administrative processes, but in no way are they checks. Here Gove is trying to argue that even though there'll be extra forms, extra administrative processes, these, according to him, don't count as checks. This is the kind of technicality that many have grown to expect from politicians. But, as I said a moment ago, we'll leave you to decide if administrative processes to determine more about goods count as checks. Regardless, while Gove does come to Johnson's defence, saying that there'll be no checks, he does concede some ground. Gove admits that there will be some changes, that businesses in Northern Ireland can't just give Johnson a call and then throw away their paperwork. In fact, the government's own report says the same thing. The impact assessment report that the government published at the same time as the withdrawal agreement states that some practical information will need to be provided electronically on movement of goods west to east, and acknowledges that because of this, businesses would incur additional costs. It's pretty clear by this point that Johnson's remarks don't line up with the cabinet members or with the government's impact assessment. This might not be surprising though. In fact, a businessman at the event told PA Media, "I want to believe him, but is he just being bombastic and being Boris?" He wasn't alone in this thinking, with others describing Johnson's speech as rambling and incoherent. Regardless of what Johnson actually meant by this statement, it does appear that his speech contradicts his own deal. And even though he likely wasn't being serious, his deal is an international treaty, so it's certainly not his call to tell businesses to throw away paperwork. Starmer touched on this exact point, saying it's not for Johnson to waive or ignore the obligations in the deal he's negotiated. Boris Johnson's making it up as he goes along. This is no way to seek to run the country. It seems like Johnson's attempts to appease the Northern Irish might have backfired, and possibly for more reasons than the ones we've covered already. That's because Johnson also commented,
So actually, Northern Ireland has got a great deal. It's got a great deal. You keep free movement, you keep access to the single market, but you also have, as it says in the deal, unfettered access to GB.
This might be slightly weird to hear Johnson say. It's unusual to hear Johnson praise the single market, while simultaneously trying to pull the rest of the UK out of it. In fact, the Lib Dems Brexit spokesman said that the single market and freedom of movement are a great deal. Even Boris Johnson recognises this. So why is he keeping them from the whole of the UK as part of the many benefits of EU membership? It is clear that the best deal for the UK is the one that we have now, in the EU. This is a view echoed by the SNP, whose Brexit spokesman Tommy Shepherd said that Boris Johnson himself has now demonstrated that Scotland is being singled out for a royal deal, as the only country in the UK to be taken out of the EU against our will, and given no say over our future relationship with Europe. We support the Good Friday Agreement in its entirety, and are not opposed to a special deal for Northern Ireland, but Scotland must not be placed at a competitive disadvantage. So it seems like this viral clip has caused a storm of problems for the Conservatives. It's shown Johnson contradicting the views of his own party, either showing him as misunderstanding the deal, or attempting to deliberately mislead those he was speaking to, and has also led to the SNP complaining that they're not getting the same great deal that Northern Ireland is. The clip represents one of few times that Johnson's been allowed to go off script in a relatively controlled campaign thus far, It will be interesting to see how this will impact CCHQ's tactics over the campaign period going forward, and it could make the leaders' debates only more interesting. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you want more updates on Brexit and the election as they play out. You can also hit the bell icon if you want to be notified every time we release a video, and you can find more from us across all social networks simply by searching for TLDR News. And finally, if you want your name featured at the end of the videos, just like these people, then be sure to back us on Patreon. There's a link to that in the description.